always wanna cut me down. I'm gonna send a flood, I'm gonna drown them out.
This is brave, this is Bruce, this is who I'm meant to be.
This is me.
Of course, every school leader knows if you just start your events with students like that, it doesn't matter what you say afterwards, right? So very quickly, while they're exiting the stage, I'd like to thank the Edgewood High School dance team. The Harvard Grace High School chorus. And now I've been told a couple times in my career that I need to smile more, right? And so I have an antidote. Move my office to Harvard Grace Elementary School. I think if I could start my days there, I'd never have trouble coming up with a smile. So the fantastic students from all three groups that were there tonight, thank you to them. To their school leaders, and the teachers who take care of them every day. So I need to use the phone here for a little bit because there's just way too many thank yous, and I'm going to try to avoid some of the names. Sorry about that. And I'm going to start with this slide because I joined you all in July, and a couple weeks later, we announced the entry plan, which is sometimes called Superintendent's Entry Plan, sometimes Listen and Learn Tour. And of course, we did a little graphic to try to capture what went into this, with tonight being the culminating event. 48 interviews of community leaders. Many of them are here tonight. I'd like to thank them. 53 individual interviews with our principals. We have 53 school principals. I can't tell you how much I learned from these two groups. I'd like to thank them as well. Just a few meetings with students. I put 3 up here. I had a couple, the Harford County Student Council, the group of student councils, and then of course the Superintendent's Advisory, and a couple of other individual meetings with students, but of course many great answers come from those students. Additionally, 108 school visits. I've been to each school at least twice, some of them 3 or 4 times. 23, what did we say, 23, oh yeah, central office leaders. That's actually where I started, interviewing those people who were here. About 400 pages of notes. A lot of notes, a lot of input. 60 minutes for, most of the meetings were 1 hour. And then I also have had meetings with each of the board members. And that included Josh Haltozewski, our student member, who is also a student here at Harford Tech and my sound guy tonight. So he wears a lot of hats for us. So before I would like to thank my Board of Education members, all the legislators who are here, all of the people who attended community meetings and those different events, the technology department here, even Harford Community College helped us out. They did the draping back there in the hallways. You always have these partners who help with things. Fine Arts Department brought together our students. It's just so much. I mean, the thing about this community is there's always people here to jump in and give a hand. And that didn't take me long to learn. Let's go back. So, what I would like to share with you tonight is, to the best of my ability, to synthesize those 400 some odd pages of notes and all these interactions with the many people who've been here. But I would like to start briefly the way I started all the community meetings. I don't have a slide for this, but you'll recognize it. So let's start with that group. Raise your hand if you attended one of our community meetings. Thank you. Raise your hand if you live in Harford County. Thank you. Raise your hand if you have a student in one of our schools. Raise your hand if you attended one of our schools. Wow. Okay, so we got a sense of who's in the room. As I said, I've had the chance in a very compressed amount of time to meet a lot of people. And what I don't have up here is a listing of all the different partnerships that I've heard about, of the work that's going on behalf of our students, on behalf of our staff, and our entire school district. And many people in this room represent those partnerships. So I want to thank all of you, because I'll thank you for what you've done so far, but also for what you're going to be doing in the future, because we're going to be relying on you. This evening, I want to cover quickly 5 topics. We've kind of worked on number 1 there, a little bit of summary of the Listen and Learn tour. We're going to talk about budget. We're going to talk about safety. We're going to talk about instruction. And then I'm going to close with some next steps, some of the findings, some of what people can expect. And I guess what I'd like to do is, before we get started, I do need to manage expectations a little bit. This is a big school district. Many of these things I want to share tonight, these things that will reveal a little bit of the way I look at the work and the opportunities I see in what we do, these are going to take some time. So, you can't go back to your schools tomorrow and say, here's the new way, here's how we're doing it, because we're not going to be there yet. But we are going to work together to get there. So, in the community meetings, now many of you attended those, I ask questions about what people believe, because we need to understand how people think about our schools and the ideas that drive them. And around belief, I had some slides, and I'm not going to go through those again, but we talked about how we have sometimes conflicting beliefs, sometimes around where we need to be consistent, other times where we need freedoms and more liberties to do the work independently. Also, there's an expectation, as the biggest spenders of taxpayer dollars in the schools, there's an expectation of efficiency, and of course an expectation of accountability. And how all of those expectations come together in the work we do is often, obviously we find many great ideas in those shared beliefs, but we also find a lot of conflict because we have a lot of disagreements about how best to do it. Now, I've worked in schools, this is, I think, I can't count, 24 years, my 24th year in education. I've not met people who didn't care about education. Everyone I meet cares and has, but they're also really passionate about it, and they have a lot of ideas. And so how we bring those ideas together to do the work is the hard part. So here's what we got. This is the quick summary of our notes from the community meetings. You see a ton of text up there, right? And you've all seen these word splashes before. The bigger the word, the more you heard the term. We heard a lot about career programs and the need for career-oriented programs. Positive teacher dispositions, I think that was one of our headings. We're talking about the relationships. Curriculum, belief statements, community outreach. It's all there. Now, it was a little hard to synthesize that into a couple of basic statements. So I just have a few things that I think represent the broad brushstrokes of what I heard. Almost every interview, because I started my interviews by asking, what do we celebrate? What's great about Harford County? And I can say what's great about Harford County or what's great about Harford County Public Schools, but regardless of which question I asked, the people and the relationships were the first thing I heard from everybody. We have great people here. We have some very strong relationships, as I referenced the partnerships that I've heard about. These are among our greatest assets. And so as I go farther through the presentation, you're going to see how we're going to try to leverage that. We're going to build on that strength. What else did I hear? We talked a lot about teachers. We talked about the need to recruit and retain teachers, a challenge for every school district in this country. One of the things we've talked about is something I presented our administrators at the summer kickoff, was the fact that currently the jobs market across the country, we have as many vacancies as we have people looking for jobs. We are in kind of those searching have a lot more options than they used to. That makes it more competitive, harder for us to recruit, harder for us to retain. It makes it quintuply hard when you're trying to recruit diverse staff to reflect a school district, because every school district in the country is trying to do just that. And so we have to come up with some very creative solutions about how to do that. What else? Heard a lot about hands-on learning. Heard a lot about the need to engage students and to have them be involved and active. I heard a lot of conversations where they talked about what's the right balance between using technology and running around the playground. Our kids need both to be successful. So our job is to figure out what the right balance is and how we deliver in both areas so that our kids are healthy, engaged, excited, and also prepared. Now, if you take the first two, this is a slide I've actually used a number of times through my career, because this is really how I believe education sort of works. We are in a relationship industry, that this work is about relationships. And as I've already indicated, what do people celebrate here? They celebrate the relationships. So we're working from a place of strength to say that we need to continue focusing on those relationships. I don't believe a teacher can effectively teach a student they don't know. So we got to learn our kids. We got to learn our community. Relevance, we talked about the engaged learner, the active learner, the hands-on, those things that attract kids and make it interesting for them. So we need to start with the relationships. When we know who our kids are, what motivates them, then we can know how to motivate them. But that last one is the target. We need to motivate them to work at this level, to push them to the very top of what they're capable of. And that's where the rigor, so it's all channeled toward this outcome of pushing our kids to maximize their potentials. What else did I hear? We need to involve people in problem solving. Now, if you watch our board meetings or you've seen some of the things that have come out, this is something I've already begun doing. Okay, we've already created committees to involve some of our public in some of the work. But the entry plan is, I'm not going to do it every year. It was a lot of work. But the strategies of going out and listening and talking and taking in input, that will be something we continue to do. We need to involve people. The talent is here. The energy and the commitment is right here in this community. We just need to access it. So here's something else I heard. So assessment is something we've heard a fair bit about and how much you should be assessing. Now, when I was in North Carolina, I used a metaphor to put this idea of, if you're a hog farmer, how much you should be. Well, okay, we did hogs in North Carolina because all of their barbecue was pork-based. And in Wilson, actually, where I worked, the Smithfield bacon plant produced 750,000 pounds of bacon 6 days a week. So people got those metaphors related to hogs. So I said, how can I make this work for Harford County? So I've seen a lot of signs with sheep on them. So here's how it goes. I just needed a little humor here, folks. It's going to be a long night. How do we strike that balance between weighing the sheep to make sure they're making the progress we need them to make and feeding them to make sure they're getting what they need in our minds to be successful? So, please don't take the metaphor too far, because that's not really how I think of our kids as sheep, right? Nor do I think of any, but put it in your head that sense of how much time are we spending weighing, how much time are we spending feeding? We got to get the balance right. Sometimes I think we try to solve a problem, we jump into, oh, let's give another test and figure out what they know, and what they're going to do, and all of a sudden we feel like that's all we're doing. So this is just one of those things we think about, and I heard quite a bit about that. Here's another thing I heard a lot about: leadership. System administration, Board of Education, school leaders. We create policies. We design curriculum. We make a lot of decisions for those people in our school district. Or we think we're doing it for them. We shouldn't be doing it for them. Because often, how those who we think we're doing the work for feel like we're doing it to them. And I've heard a lot of that. They made this decision and now we... Again, the inclusive work, the problem solving, the approach to doing the work. Now, working in big groups gets a little messy sometimes. I can just show you on my notes. It's a lot of input. So we got to find the right balance. We can't do everything with a cast of 50 or 100 or 1,000 people. But we need to dig in because, again, 53 meetings with principals. What I learned there were a couple things I learned. One, I learned there's a ton of talent leading our schools. And they could tell me, they could celebrate some of the great things that are going on with their teachers and with their students. But another thing I learned is we didn't get them together enough to help solve the district's challenges. A frequent theme I heard was that they didn't have time to come together to do the work. They weren't always involved in a lot of the decisions. That's a challenge we could fix. It doesn't cost much. And I know we can do better there. And if I had had a chance to interview the 2,500 teachers we have, I would have heard the same thing. I have every confidence. How we bring people together, how we make these decisions with them. Now, I hesitated whether to use this slide because this is one that I like to use, particularly when I'm working internally with our school system. Because when you think of a school district, you have sort of a central office, and you have a couple other offices, you have schools and students. But the idea is to flip that hierarchy on its head. We are still responsible for monitoring and supervising the work in the schools. But we need to understand how we can work in a more supportive manner, how our first priority can be support. Again, this kind of a little bit, it relates to the weighing and the feeding. We need to do more feeding. We need to be providing more support, more resources, more work to give the room for our people to work. And so those in the system leadership need to be supporting the school leaders so that those in the schools can support your instructional leaders, your teachers, your paraprofessionals, those who are on the front lines with the students. They need the support. And then, of course, they have the responsibility of supporting the students. So thinking about support, this is work, again, this is work I've already begun with our leadership, and it's going to take a while to understand this. How do we change that paradigm? Because one of the things, again, this is a relationship industry. When we can get away from the language of they did, those people up there, board members, how many times you've been referred to in a very general term? This is relationships. We're talking with, this is a big community, but it's not that big. We're dealing with people. And we can tap into those strengths and personalize this quite a bit more. Now, I'm going to do a little transition here to the next topic, because one of the many things, and there are a bunch of these, but this is the one I wanted to highlight for everyone to capture. I also heard a lot of perceptions, some of which I think I learned weren't exactly accurate. In some cases, the perceptions I heard in my conversations were things that maybe were true once upon a time. In Maryland, if you look at beginning teacher pay, our school district has the 9th highest beginning teacher salary. Now, these school districts, the difference between like 5 and 15, in many cases are just a few $100s per year. So in terms of take-home pay, it doesn't add up that much, but we're ninth, okay? But when we get into our budget slides, which are coming up next, you're going to hear about healthcare and the cost of healthcare. But healthcare is one of the things that we've actually emphasized and protected in this school district. And in fact, I would argue, if you look line for line with regard to not only what we offer in our healthcare, but also in how much of the costs we pass on to our employees, we have one of the most generous benefits packages there, because if you take the beginning salary minus what it would cost to be enrolled in the family plan of the healthcare as a new employee, we're third in the state. In other words, salary after benefits, we're only behind Baltimore City and Montgomery County. I don't think that's the perception a lot of our folks have when they think about teacher pay. And we could argue there's other spots on the pay scale that we need to do better work. And I completely understand that. I'm not glossing that over. But in terms of our perception and how we tell our story and what people know about us when we're recruiting, I know what it costs to live in Rockville. If you add housing to that calculus, there may be some places in Baltimore where you could live inexpensively, but if you add housing costs, we should be the best place for teachers to work in the state. And I genuinely believe that. So let's talk budget. I got to get this out of the way because I got to come back up after we do it. And it's going to be. So some of you know the realities. You know what we're facing. And one thing we've heard frequently is we need more transparency around budget. We need to understand. I mean, it's hard because we start talking about all these numbers, and I don't know about you, but if I weren't in this business, I probably wouldn't be going to the meetings to hear all the details. It's just, I want to make sure folks are taken care of. But I'm going to try in a few short slides here to give you the basics. So very briefly, where do our employees work? 23% high school, 19% of our employees are in middle schools, 41% work in elementary schools, 4 are in some combination, maybe in 2 or 3 different schools at different levels, and that leaves 13% of our employees are not school-based employees. So you have 87% of the people in schools every day. So that's the first thing. The big buckets for our budget. That thin green line up there, 3% administrative services. Transportation, we spend about 8% of our operating fund on transportation, about 11% on operations, and then of course that leaves 78% doing the core of our work around instruction. So these are the big pictures with our budget. And these numbers, you can find them in our online budget guide. The trouble is you got to weed through all the pages because it's a lot. But if you want to go in there, that's there. The answers are there for people. It's just hard to kind of dig through which ones to really focus on. So I'm going to give you some numbers here. You certainly don't need to memorize them. Again, they're in the book. Total operating budget, $491 million plus dollars. We have restricted and unrestricted. Essentially, unrestricted is the stuff we really get to make decisions about. Restricted are the ones that come with, here, you have to spend it this way. Our major sources of revenue, federal revenue, state revenue, local. You can see the numbers. Federal's about $20 million. State's about $210. Local last year was $245, nearly $246 million. If you attended the community meeting, you saw this slide. Since 2011, our recurring revenue is up $46 million. And the question I was asking as I went out and talked to people in our community was, revenue's going up every year. We have more money every year. Why do I keep hearing about crisis? Why do I keep hearing about cutting? Why is this such a challenge for us with the revenue going up every year? And to be fair, the state sets a number that a local community must give you, and this community's always exceeded that. Okay? That $46 million increase, nearly all of that comes from our local government because our state money's been flat and our federal money's been flat for different reasons. same time frame, since 2011, when we maxed out in our, again, in our operating budget, there's a couple other people in other spots, but I'm talking about the operating budget. That's the one that we passed locally. Over 5,200 employees in 2011. We've cut 456 positions since that time. So as the $46 million was going up, we're still needing to cut people. Here's the driver. The biggest culprit, our health insurance. We talked about that. Now, health insurance, of course, has been going up nationally. It's a challenge across the country. In that same time frame, it's gone up nearly $30 million, the part that the school district pays. Now, if you did the math on the 456 positions, if you do a really rough estimate, around 15 positions per million, which isn't, I mean, very rough, that's $30 million. If we had that those additional people, these increases would have been $30 million higher. But we've had to cut every year to keep up with these costs. Our salaries have gone up. Again, we've been working in this district. These have been hard decisions. Been working in this district to make sure we could catch up because we'd fallen behind some of the other districts. That perception that we didn't pay as well was accurate just a few years ago. We weren't in those spots we are this year because this community has supported, making sure that people got their steps and got their increases. But by doing that, that's caused our salaries to go up every year. And then, of course, the pension, that wasn't us. The state said, okay, we're not going to pay for this anymore. You're not going to pay for nearly $9 million a year of the pension that came with no offsetting revenue. So no one in town here said, this is a good idea. This was something that we received. So a little more on budget. So here are some numbers that you didn't see in the community meeting. Very quick comparison of the 2019 and 2020 budgets. What we've done here is there's some assumptions. I wanted to get these numbers before anticipating an increase in revenue. As we said, our local government, our county government has given us increases every year. I'm presuming that will happen again, but I don't know what it's going to be. So we put flat revenue from the county in there as an assumption just to build this, but we know it's going to go up. We just don't know how much. State, we don't expect to go up much. If it does, it'll be less than $500,000 because now that we've seen, we have just about 100 more students this year than we did last year. So that we should get paid for that, but that won't take a big dent out of us in terms of that change. Federal stays flat. Our other costs will stay fairly flat. One of the things we build our budget using these sources of revenue, but there's one other source, and that's the fund balance. And I know that's been in the newspaper, and people have had the chance to read about it, and it takes a little bit to really understand what we mean by fund balance. But essentially, each year, we spend a certain percentage of our budget, and there's a little bit left over at the end of the year because we write a budget with what we expect to be 100% of our expenditure, and our target is to always spend less than that 100%. The little bit that's left over goes into fund balance, and we can carry that forward. And there's a lot more about the fund balance, but you build up a certain amount of it, and then if you need to balance the budget, last year, the board made a decision to assign $10.9 million of the available fund balance to balance the budget. Now, it was done to make sure we could meet our commitment to our employees and the salaries. It was done for a good reason, but it was done. And the challenge is we don't have that revenue to use in 2020. And so you've seen board meetings, you've read paper. That's one of the things that we're working on. So where last year you saw revenue in our budget of $461 million locally. Right now, again, remember, we didn't include the increases, and they're going to come. But right now, we're anticipating that 450 plus whatever those increases are. You'll need to not remember that number. I'm going to show it to you again. So on the other side, we have our expenses. Those are the revenue. That's the revenue we anticipate from the last slide. So now what do we expect to spend? You see the 2019 numbers. It adds up to that $461 million, which is the revenue. Now, I'm going to do this bottom up because the top line, no one here's seen. The other category is expenses like increasing fuel costs and just those sorts of things that go up every year. We're expecting about a 2% increase in that, which leads us to about $2 million. So we've added that in. Healthcare. We're expecting that to go up 10%. And not just next year, but probably, I mean, our consultants, you know, we have people watching this. It's an $80 million line item this year. So that's another $8 million just in healthcare costs that we expect to see that go up. The top number in salaries originally kept that flat because we didn't want to commit to any salaries. But what I want to include there is I don't think, and board, you can all jump up and tell me if I'm wrong. I don't think we can go into this year without an expectation of not falling behind again. We need to do our steps. We need to do those things, at least stay on track so that our salaries and all that don't fall behind. But if we're going to do that, if we're going to set that as our goal, just keep those things in place. That's about another $8 million bill. Just an estimate. But when you look at that, that adds up to our projected increase in expenditures, or the projected expenditures in that nearly $480 million, again up from the 461, and we have $10 million less to use because we spent the fund balance. So this is what we need to figure out right now to present a balanced budget for next year that includes those new costs, including the steps and those other parts. So I think are absolutely critical that we include. We need to work on a $30 million gap right now. Exacerbated a little bit by the fact that we don't have that $11 million of fund balance to use again. Our fund balance is more or less, you could calculate it nearly at zero. There's a little in there, but so we got to do this $30 million in our budget. And I'll state another thing. There's no point in us asking our county government for that much. They can't do it. We have to do our part first. And so, I'm not sure how much time I want to spend explaining fund balance. I'm going to skip over this. She'll be here long enough. I did a little thing on fund balance. If you want to know, give me a call. I'll give you these slides. I'm going to skip this. I got a whole explanation. I got it worked out. I could spend a half an hour on it, but you don't need that. I announced 5 teams. This is where we talk about doing it with our folks. Let me go backward a little bit. These first 2, spending freeze, hiring freeze. The reason I talked about fund balance is fund balance, as I explained, is achieved when you spend less of your budget in the year you're in. Traditionally, pretty much the last 10 years we looked at, this school district has spent between 98 and 99.1 at the highest mark % of the budget. Okay? So this is a pretty responsible budget. I mean, to be that close, you don't want to have this big gap. You know, you don't want 95 or 90% of your budget. That means you're kind of padding it, and that's not responsible. I don't think that's appropriate for the community to see. But at the same time, we can't spend more than 100%. So we've kept within that 2% range, but that means we're only generating so much of a surplus each year. It's not really a surplus, it's kind of what's left over. The spending freeze and the hiring freeze, I've announced that these 2 committees, these are current year adjustments. We have to spend less than 100% of the budget we put out there, and we have to do our belt tightening right now. We have teams working on that. We have board members contributing to that. We've also invited members of the Citizens Budget Advisory to contribute to that work so that we have not just school administrator voices, but people from outside our schools. And additionally, we have representatives. In those cases, I think we have principals there. So we have folks in the schools representing. The idea is we do the belt tightening now because what we don't spend this year, we can roll into next year to keep this $30 million from being such a big thing. But that's what those two teams are working on, specifically changes for this year. So things that get frozen right now, that doesn't mean it's an ongoing cut forever. It just means it's something we need to do this year so that the impact isn't quite as great when we get to the end of the year and finish putting the budget together. These next two teams, though, again, same setup. Folks from my administration, board members, Citizens Budget Advisory, representatives, in some cases from different associations for our employees, is we need to look at our staffing and deployment. We need to ensure we're doing that as efficiently as possible. And we need to make sure we have good processes for ensuring equity, efficiency. But if we have to cut $30 million out of our budget, that needs to be a place where we're doing some savings in the long term. And we're going to do that by improving some of our processes around that work. But this is more strategic work. I don't expect changes to processes to have any impact on this year's budget. A little bit for next year, but hopefully this is an investment of work to solve more long-standing problems. Outsourcing. Maybe I should have more words than that, because that's more business practices. What are the things we can do? What do other industries do where you have experts come in and do the work and not have it be your own employees in some cases? Those models, some schools do it, some don't. We have to study it. There are other things. There are other big contracts we need to look at. That team will be part of looking at our other big contracts. Maybe even our healthcare contract. Do we need to be studying these kinds of things? That outsourcing group is looking, again, at those long-term business practices. Are there places where we can realize efficiencies and we can improve the way we work so we operate as efficiently and as effectively as possible? Okay, so those last two teams looking at how we work. The fifth one, in many ways, is the most important. We serve 5 employee associations. They represent our entire school district. There's a small handful of people like me, a few of the senior administrators who are not in one of those associations, but it's like 20 people. Everyone else is represented by one of our associations. They all have a stake. Again, the solutions are out there. This was an experience that I learned in another school district where the power of that district came from its associations and its employees. We've now had 2 meetings with representatives from our 5 associations talking about these challenges. They've seen most of the numbers that I put up here tonight, at least the leadership has. And we need to be talking about how we work together to come up with a solution. Because if we try to do this with all these groups in isolation, it just doesn't come together in the end as something that works best for everybody. We need to take care of the entire group. So keeping those associations together, that's a group that I will continue to meet with. We have other leaders who are going to continue to meet with them. But we know, like I said before, many of the solutions for this school district are going to come from the people here, many of the people right in this room. So keeping that group together, I know bringing them together, it was one of the first times they've all been together. We've done it twice. This should be a monthly meeting of that group. And I think the real key to solving these problems is going to happen right there. I'm going to change the subject. Again, not the most uplifting of topics because it's something that scares us. Here's the challenge. We have schools. People should be happy to go to school. People should be excited to go to school. Schools should be welcoming. We want our volunteers there working with our kids. We rely on our partners to be able to come in, and we want them to come to our schools and feel welcomed when they get there. But we also need them to be safe. And so we can't separate these conversations. Everywhere I've worked, there's been a particular focus on customer service and on creating welcoming environments in our schools. That's something that is very important to me. And it is something that you can expect to see coming out of my administration, is this focus on customer service and welcoming and how we make people feel happy and engaged to be in our schools. But we can't divorce that from the conversation around safety because they overlap. So our goal is to figure out all the ways we can do both at the same time. It makes it hard. But as everyone goes into these conversations, we just can't have customer service on one task force and safety on another with all these great ideas, and then they crash in the middle. So that's the big picture. You've seen we did a little video release, working closely with county executive, county government, local law enforcement from all of our jurisdictions. We are going to be training during this year all of our employees. Starting in this calendar year, we've shuffled a little bit our schedule for professional development. We have the administrators, the school-based administrators, all trained before the calendar year ends, with the goal of training all of our teachers before the school year ends, and hopefully beginning to pilot some of those practices and the lessons for the students. See, this is one of those things. We haven't designed the whole thing yet, because I have absolute faith that when we put the content in the hands of our instructional experts, all of our teachers, they will help us design the best way to roll this out to our kids. So we're going to train them first, and then we're going to ask for their help about how best to deliver it. Because we serve all these different grade levels, and we need the message that fits each kid. And so I think with the help of all our experts here. So that'll be the work going through the spring. But this is how we work together. And I think if we're designing as we go, it allows it to be a little more dynamic. It allows us to be responsive. It allows us to make adjustments to make it better every year as new information comes in, so that we don't fall behind in those best practices. This isn't a one-time thing. Safety is ongoing in our adjustments to it. Now, when we talk about safety, we could talk about prevention, the run, hide, fight, what we do in those critical incidents. But this is probably the even greater safety challenge. The need to support our students and our adults who work in our schools. This has changed even since I was a principal. I left the principalship in 2008, so 10 years ago. And I didn't have these same needs, even just 10 years ago. Now, I wanted to give you a little bit of our rank. Now, these ranks, State Department of Ed data, and this is student to employee ratios. So interestingly, now there's some funny data in the psychologists, and I almost wanted to use this as an example the other night. We're sixth, at least according to the state data, in terms of the ratio of psychologists to students, which is good news. But if I'm not mistaken, we're nearly 24th in terms of the amount of our budget we spend on psychologists, which means we're not paying our psychologists enough, which we know because Baltimore County stole a whole bunch of them from us this year. So we got stuff to figure out. Counselors, 16th in the counselor to student ratio. Nurses, 19th in the ratio. Pupil personnel workers, 22. Now again, 24 counties. 22 out of 24 is not so great. This is an area, again, you saw the budget challenge, makes us even harder to figure out. But if we're not dealing with the mental health needs of our students, and quite frankly, of our faculty also, we're not setting anyone up for success. So on top of all the things we're addressing, this is a place where we need to continue to put energy. Because I'll tell you what, how many times have you seen a flag at half-mast this year? This is just right out front here. This is our flag here at Harford Tech. And, I've seen a lot of those. I don't remember a year like this. So I don't have quantitative data on, I'd be curious how many times in a year the governor says we need to put our flags at half-mast. In our schools, the work on addressing intolerance, that's where it happens. I mean, we have access to the kids and they're together. So how we focus on that? Again, one of those many challenges. Every school district needs to be doing more of it. We know it. We've heard it. We heard it from a number of students at our board meeting Monday night who had the courage to stand up and tell us their stories. It's hard sometimes to hear the frustrations coming from students and employees, but I'll tell you what, it's one of the things I value in Harford County, as I know you can tell me that maybe down the road I won't want 10 and 11 public comments at every meeting, but it's important to hear from people. We can go back, we can check, and we can figure out how to work with those groups so they feel heard. But this is the one I remember from Monday night, the students who told us how they didn't feel protected in our schools. We're not alone. Every district in the country is dealing with this. I don't know that anyone has the answer, and there are no simple answers. But we have the right people, we have the right talent. We're going to figure it out. So let's talk about instruction. Now, interestingly, I say instruction, you just heard me talk student services and to some degree cultural competence and cultural understanding. This is one of the things, and I've said this in a couple different settings. In our leadership, in our administration, we have the Central Instructional Leadership Team that has traditionally included the directors for, the executive directors for secondary education, elementary education, curriculum, professional development, accountability. Last year, Mrs. Canavan added equity or the diversity and cultural competence to the team and student services to the team. Kind of forward thinking, because those two topics need to be central to what we do. So it's one of those things, I appreciate her foresight for doing that, and it makes our team richer. Do we know exactly how to keep those two topics central to our work? Not entirely, but we're working on it. And that's what this is about. So when I say instruction, I didn't mean to put those somewhere else because they really kind of belong in this heading. So very briefly, park. Oh my. Not a lot of love for park in this state, and there's been some questions. And we have some challenges. And I've heard some different, and I think there's some very reasonable responses to why some of our scores weren't where we wanted them to be. A couple of things I've been able to tease out in my conversations, both from community members and from principals and others I've had a chance to speak to. So I don't need to dwell on this much. Elementary school, we were up the tiniest bit in math, down in English language arts. Middle school, down a little bit in math, down a little bit in English language arts. Again, state scores went up a little bit on average, but not much. There were no. High school, again, down a little bit in both areas. Now, if I had to attribute this, there's a couple things. One, I think last year was the first year we required everyone to do this on computers. We'd done really well in our scores when they were doing pencil and paper. Changing was a challenge. But another thing, I can take you back to the slide, we've cut 456 positions in the last 10 years. That's going to have an impact. So this isn't an area, we have to do this because we have to keep improving, but we have to also keep it in perspective. Back to the sheep, right? The weighing and the feeding. Now, talking to principals, mostly heard the elementary principals outnumber the middle and high school. So the ones that kept coming up on my radar were two elementary initiatives. Lucy Calkins Writing, which just finished its first year in full implementation across our district, and Envision Mathematics, which just finished its second year in full implementation across our district. So let me just talk very briefly about those. Because when you introduce something new, that always brings some challenges. What we heard about Lucy Calkins was it's a ton of work for the teachers. The planning, it's a very detailed program, and it requires a lot of planning, and it's a lot of work when teachers have a lot on their plate. But at the same time, again, reporting from my conversations, the products the kids are producing are good. It's a good thing to do for kids, with kids, to help them improve in these areas. And I'll tell you, over the last 20 years in our focus on English language arts and mathematics, a lot of districts have lost touch with writing, which of course hasn't helped them much because you express those things with writing. But a lot of people have lost focus on it. So to come into a district that said, you know, we got to get back into this thing about how we're going to teach writing well. And this is a good program, and it's worth the investment. And in fact, they even didn't get to do the whole thing last year, and so there's more to learn as we go. So this is an initiative that I believe, based on everything I've heard, is something that is good for kids and worth the investment of time and energy. Envision math. I had a slide which I deleted. It was a quote from a report written in 1910. People complaining about the math curriculum. I didn't include it. Sorry, there's a lot of words. It didn't make sense. But the whole point is, this is the never-ending conflict, right? Like, math curriculum is just something no one's ever happy. And so I had to apply the same filter when I was asking about Envision Math, because I heard about some concerns early on, that it's one of those things when we shifted what we did in this math program, that first the frustrations, well, we had concerns from teachers, but we also had a lot of frustrations from parents. And it was hard to kind of learn how to support their kids, because the way we're doing math, it's always the new math, right? Well, this is the next iteration of the new math. But again, back to the principles, is this good for kids? Is it worth investing in? And again, the resounding response is yes. Partly what this means for me is when you're rolling out a new initiative like this one, like Envision Math, you need to be a little stricter early on in terms of following the rules and learning it and getting a full understanding of what's in there. And that's the part that's so frustrating for people, because it feels like we flipped a switch and now you can't do any of the old stuff. But you kind of have to require it to be a little tighter. Because over time, what we run into is we know we have teachers in our classroom who've been doing this for a long time and they're really good at it. And we've asked them not to use some of those things they know works, which is definitely frustrating. Over time, those other things can creep back in, but we got to give it a minute to make sure we learn the core of what we have here. It doesn't mean that we have the very best, but again, is it a good program? Is it worth investing in? Yes. The feedback was consistent. We need to keep investing in this. But over time, you know, we start looking at how we can enhance it as needed. But this is the type of thing that I, again, would suggest that we keep going and keep going deeper on. Now, when I was searching for school districts, an old mentor of mine said, Sean, you don't need to limit your search based on the state. He said, because every state is crazy. I was coming out of North Carolina, where I had watched the silliness of all the things that were happening in schools, being done to schools. And one of my mentors has been a superintendent in 5 different states, and he said, you can't use that as a way to eliminate the places to look. And I said to him, I wanted to be back in Maryland. I'm very excited, very happy to be here. But I knew there was stuff going on, and here are some of them. Star ratings. We haven't talked to you a lot about this. In December, though, you're going to see some news. The state of Maryland is giving every single school in the state a star rating, 1 star to 5 stars. The details about that have not been fully worked out, I don't believe. I think they know, but they haven't shared. Like, we don't know what those ratings are going to be. So we believe, I think what we're going to hear is, I think it's the December 4th State Board of Ed meeting. These are going to be released. That'll be a big press release. So all I ask is just learn what you can from it. Pay attention, because it is important that our schools look like they're at the top. But we're going to see some variance in there. Now, I'll tell you what I experienced in North Carolina when the research was done, because they rolled something like this out in 2015. And the scores at the bottom there, it was an 8F grading system. The scores in the Fs, the likelihood that you had an F was almost completely consistent with the amount of poverty in your school. They put the scatter plot up of poverty to grades. It was a perfect match. Now, Maryland's accountability system, as I've seen it, looks more thoughtful, but it's still, I'm not sure. So when you see those star ratings come out, we'll put the information out, we'll pass along the press release, and we will share the ratings for the schools. That's a big part of what we need to do. Hopefully we'll have better answers for you. I mean, we know a little bit of what goes into these scores. I mean, we've gotten updates on how they're calculating them, but not enough to be able to calculate them ourselves yet. So that's coming. Park. I had a meeting with superintendents last week, and we hear from folks from the state frequently. If you listen, not a lot of love for Park, the upper leadership in the state. The problem is, federal money we get, there's a lot of federal money attached to ensuring we have assessments. Now the governor said we don't want any more Park, and it's going to end this year. The trouble is the State Department of Ed has not yet identified what the new assessment tool is going to be. But they're working on it because they have to. So we're expecting a fair bit of questions and confusion and frustration. Now, the one thing we know, and this is what we work to, is we've been assured that the new assessment system that's going to be rolled out will be based on the state standards that are in the state, that the state expects. And so we need to just keep doing our job and teaching to the standards, and we'll let the assessments take care of themselves. So if I haven't shared more with you about that, or we haven't had people share more with you about that, partly it's because we're still waiting on some answers. But our job is still pretty straightforward. We know what the standards are. We need to prepare our students to be successful with those. So that's coming. Just recently, there's a statewide committee working on graduation requirements. They've made some recommendations, or they've drafted some recommendations. They're not law yet. Nothing's changed in terms of graduation requirements yet, but that's coming, and so we need to keep you updated on that. So watch for that. I've heard the draft changes. They're not dramatic. There's some areas, in a couple areas where we're shifting, we're going to require a whole credit versus a half credit, these sorts of things. So you can watch for that. That's coming. And then another thing that they've included, and that's in this year's accountability model, is this premise of student growth. And I know I'm getting a little bit into the weeds on what we're doing, but I want you to understand this, because I think, while this is still something that's shaping up at the state level, this is a new element in our state accountability system. And these ratings were about the star ratings. In fact, the growth of our students is weighted more heavily in this new accountability model than the average proficiency, in other words, the performance. So let's talk about this for a second. Sorry, it's a little hard to see. Since No Child Left Behind hit, and this is something that I've been thinking about for years, but again, Maryland didn't have a good measure of growth until just recently, so they're still sorting it out. But since No Child Left Behind, we had the sense of there's a line that if the kids score, if they take their state tests, and they get over that line, and they get into the proficiency side, so our job's done, right? So if you have a whole group of students, you have some kids who come to you above the line, you have some kids who come to you below the line, and if you're strategic, and this is what's happened all across the country, if you're strategic, you take a look at that group of kids right below the line, and you figure out how to get them above the line, because that's going to improve your percentage, right? So if you're really successful, this is about what you get. You move a bunch of kids up, but the trouble is, those kids at the top, they didn't move much. Those kids at the bottom, they didn't move much, because our energy was focused on those kids in the middle. So now, we were successful, we got more kids in the middle, but we left some kids behind at both ends. The goal of growth, goal of focusing on growth, is to figure out how to look at kids at all different levels. And again, the state's digging into this, but yet the data we have from them so far, we haven't quite figured out how to use it, because we need to understand how they create it so we can really not make too many assumptions about what goes into it, but we want to be able to use it well, because I do believe that investing and understanding this better is something that this district would really benefit from and will be good for kids. Because the whole idea is, so if you look at that bottom group there, those students in the red, there are some teachers who start their school year with a bunch of kids down there. And remember when I was talking about the grade ratings before? We look at The close correlation with poverty and historical performance. What's hard to tell? Let's just use a scale we understand, 1 to 100. So if you have a whole class of students who started on average at about 30%, and you grew them, on average, they got up to 45% over the course of the year. Is that good? It's hard to know. They didn't meet standard, if our bar is where it normally is, but they grew 15 percentage points. I mean, is that good? We don't know. The idea of how they're looking at growth in the state is each student's getting an individual percentile score, which should tell them, how did this student do compared to other students who started at the same score this year? If you started in the bottom 25th percentile, how did other kids in that area do? Did they move 15%? Or on average, did they move 20%? So if you move 15, you actually didn't do as well as the other kids in the state. This is designed to help us see how we do with kids at different levels. Because the proficiency just gave us that group in the middle. Did we get over the line? Now, if you look, so we do have some percentile, growth percentile that will be coming out soon. You can start to look, and you're going to find some schools on there. For example, when I looked at elementary mathematics, one of the schools that grew quickest, had some of the highest growth percentiles, Aberdeen Elementary School. I'm sorry. Oh boy, that was a terrible step. Edgewood Elementary School. You wouldn't choose schools from certain communities to see as your top growing schools in the district. But with the right growth measure, when you look at the performance of individuals. So again, this is an area where we're going to spend some more time working, and you're going to start hearing people talk about growth percentiles. I don't know when I'm going to get a chance to explain it to you again. That's why we did it tonight. But this helps us address, because what you're trying to do is if you're successful, they all move. That means your kids at the top move. That means your kids at the bottom move. And you know how they're doing compared to other kids in the States who started in the same place. If we can ensure that we grow every one of our students at least a year's worth in a year, I think we're setting, a hard goal, because a lot of places have trouble. Certain groups, we have a hard time moving them. Because at the other end, we don't know. If a student started at the 92nd percentile and they moved up to the 94th, is 2% enough at the top? It's harder to move when you're in the last few there. So this is a way that we can continue to focus on all students. And so again, some of our investment in terms of the way we look at our students, the way we look at what success means in the classroom and with kids. Growth is one of those things we'll be talking more about. Okay, so here's a slide. I've used this one a number of times in the past. This is based on a study that was done first in 2006 and then updated in 2014. It looks at text complexity. In other words, simple terms, how hard is a book to read? Not from the comprehension, but just how hard are the words, right? And so the text lexile measure is what's up on the one side, and then along the bottom is the different settings. So in high school, we think of our literature classes, our English classes, as the place where we teach reading. That's where we actually teach kids to read. And the texts, on average, again, how the study was done is they collected lots of books from all over the country from these classes. And the complexity of the texts that schools were introducing and using with their students were in this range, this, 750 to about 950 range. Now, the study then moved over to colleges. And the text complexity that students encountered in their college literature courses, that's kind of what you'd expect. A little more rigorous, a little overlap with what they got in high school, okay? But we're pushing the envelope a little as they move up. But here's the thing, and this is where we struggle. Other high school texts, in other words, the ones you're getting not in the English classes, the text complexity is actually greater. But those aren't the places where we teach reading necessarily. We teach the subjects in high school a lot of times. And the focus on how we teach students to contend with more complex material is an area where we need to continue to focus, because this is building, of course, the college textbooks other than in the literature courses, even more complex. And the trouble is, if we view high school literature as our high bar, the textbooks for courses other than literature, we haven't even touched. There's no overlap between those high school courses and what they're seeing in college. Okay, so here's where it starts to get interesting. The next one up there, I know the text is a little small. The next category, because now we start talking about what are we preparing kids to do. Are we preparing them for college? Are we preparing them for the workforce? In this case, are we preparing them for the military? A new military recruit, what are you going to encounter? The texts that you will need to be proficient with are above what we're giving you in high school. There was a study done a number of years ago. I think it was Joel Klein from New York with Condoleezza Rice, and they basically said only about 30% of our high school grads could qualify to make it in the military. That's not how we think of preparing our kids. We need to do more in that area. Personal use, lease agreements, insurance, bills, the manuals for everything you buy and have to figure out how to work, right? Essentially personal use, these are the things you need to be an independent adult, you know, not living with your parents, right? Does anyone have kids? I won't ask you to raise your hand, forget it. Some of you may have kids living with you. I hope it's not because of this. But preparing people to be independent, again, if we rely on just the books we're using in our high school classes, we're not quite there yet. Entry-level occupations, again, covers a whole range. Are we preparing people to join the workforce at any level? It's ultimately the goal, right? Even if we're sending them to college first, we want them to get to the workforce. Again, you don't have that overlap. So here's the one that may be a little surprising. SAT, ACT, AP. So let's just talk about advanced placement for a second. Advanced placement we think of as something just for the top kids, right? But advanced placement is right there in the strike zone with the prepared for life areas. Those rigorous courses that we've only pushed certain kids toward are the only thing that our high school kids are encountering on level with what they need to be successful in college, in the military, or in life as an independent adult. So that's what we often view as our high bar for most kids. This is the target we say we're working toward. This is college and career readiness. It's not college just for some and career for the other. Career, independent living as an adult, that's the line we need to get them to. Do we need programs that meet kids' needs differently? Absolutely. But we don't just do this to be academic elitist and say everyone has to take AP. It's because it's the best independent measure we have of whether kids are really ready. These two places, college textbooks and SAT, ACT, AP, what we're preparing them to do in those, shouldn't be the target just for some. So I put this out there as, again, national study, last updated in 2014. So fairly timely in terms of what people are encountering out there in the workforce and all of that. So let's talk about some next steps. And I'm going to start with what you saw in that last slide. I've spoken with a number of our high school principals about this. I've spoken with a number of board members. I've shared this briefly. This is not a goal that the board has agreed on, so we're going to talk more. But this is something that, to me, makes sense for our community. Not easy, though. I think, well, we can't make this a graduation requirement or a deterrent, I don't believe, because the state sets those. I think we should have a goal of preparing every single one of our graduates to tick one of these 3 boxes. The first one, you saw on the last slide, advanced placement, or in this district, there's also the equivalent international baccalaureate that we have at Ed.D High School. 3 or more on an AP test, 4 or more on an IB test. If a student passes just one of those assessments, not just takes the course, but passes one of those assessments, we know they're college ready. Now, we did a study of this a number of years back in another district where we looked at students who had passed an AP test, just taken a course but not the test, or hadn't. Degree completion for a cohort of students in those 3 scales, to have a degree, a college degree within 6 years, if you'd passed an AP test, it was over 75%. If you'd just taken an AP or an IB course while in high school but not passed one of the assessments, it was 50% of those graduates had a degree within 6 years. If you hadn't taken, 30% had a degree within 6 years. The outcomes match the work. This should be a target for more kids. Right now, about 28% of our students, I believe, are checking this box before they graduate. We can grow that. It's a lot of work. However, there are other options. To me, this one's just self-evident. If you can earn college credit while you're in high school, you demonstrated that you can make it in college. It's not exactly the same. Taking one course while in high school is maybe not as rigorous as taking a full load in college, but you show us you can do it. Demonstrate to us. Now, we don't have room in our programs right now for as many kids as we need doing this. So this, it's great to have good partners in town with Harford Community College, with Towson and Mattoon and those other groups. I've had some experience at higher ed. We need to work more with higher ed. How can we find other ways to give our students more access to college work while they're with us so we know they can do it? Check the box. Show us you're college ready. If you're not going to do AP, let's look here. The third one is career licensure. Do we offer enough programs to ensure every student can be prepared for at least one career before they graduate from us? Now, a good goal is you complete a CTE pathway. I think that's very telling. I want something a little more concrete. You've got the first one, pass an AP test, show me you've done it. Earn college credit, check. I think the third one is obtain licensure in some career area, which means we need to create more opportunities for people to have access to the programs. And as a system, with the board, all of us, again, remembering we're dealing with some limited resources here, but being strategic. If we can set a goal that our students, before they graduate, if we get to 100% of our kids, because we can get really close, nearly 100% of our kids are completely capable of checking one of these 3 boxes. Again, I know we have about 28% checking the AP box, AP or IB. I don't have good data on the other 2. So, already had some discussions with the community college about data sharing, and that's something we got to figure out here soon. But again, great partners over there to help us do that. And also making sure we have a good sense of who's earning licensures. I think if we set a commitment to have all of our graduates hit one of these 3 areas, it will change our conversations, but it's concrete. And I'd love to be back in front of you 4, 5, 6 years and say, okay, we're almost there. We're at 75%, or we're at 80, or we're at 90%. Let's push that last little bit. I think we can do that, but that, again, is going to take some time and some work. So, winding down here, what will we be working on? You've heard me talk about all these different areas. You've heard me talk about the importance of reading. Now again, some of that work's already in the pipeline, but we need to do more, and we need to make sure we have all of our employees, our entire community, contributing to how we do that work. How will we focus on continuing to address the mental health challenges that our students are facing? Again, we have some work going on in that area, but it's something that we can't lose sight of. Engagement with our students, that sense of hands-on learning, and whatever it is, whatever those things are that we do to make sure our kids just love coming to school. I mean, I made my joke about Harvard Grace Elementary. I can tell you how it feels to walk into that school. That's why I want to move my office there. We can do that for everybody. We're close. We have a great, great school district. Growth, I probably spent way too much time on that, but you got the idea. This is something that we need to keep focusing on. But the reason that's so important is because I want to know that all kids on the entire spectrum, regardless of where they start, that we're moving them. And then the last one, of course, high school programs. Making sure we have the offerings and making sure we have a way to get kids into those so that they can have a chance of checking one of those 3 boxes for us. So very quickly, a couple questions that I'll be asking. These shouldn't be surprises. How do we ensure that all of our students and staff will be both physically and psychologically safe? There's a lot of work to do there. And that's a constant moving target. It's great to have so many talented people to help us address it. How will we strike that right balance between hands-on learning and some of our more traditional approaches? You can't just swing the pendulum all the way to one side. We have a lot to do. So again, it's about balance. It's not just about emphasizing just one type of instruction. How do we build that organization that's focused on support and engagement? Support being the key word. I guess that's something that we've been focused on. I think the engagement follows if we get the support right. I had to bring a sheet back. How do we make sure we're investing enough in capacity building and not just constantly beating people over the head with the accountability? Okay, because that isn't just students. That's also the work with teachers. Do we have the right balance between evaluation system and professional development? I'd argue that we're leaning a little, our evaluation system is pretty big and cumbersome. That we could focus some of that time and energy on training, particularly training designed and organized and driven and informed by those being trained. And finally, I just kind of love, we got this great little step here of how do we enlist students at all levels to help us solve the challenges that we have? Like I said, bringing our people together more to work, it can be messy sometimes. You get a lot of people in the room and a lot of competing ideas, but a lot of good can emerge. And so it's a little hard at first. I'm already seeing some of the things we've started in the office. We have a lot of questions that we haven't been able to answer yet, but we're edging in the right direction. You've seen the challenges, they're here. You saw that number in the budget we're trying to get to. We can do that only if we do it together. Only if we as a school district do our part and rely on our elected leaders to help do theirs. And with the right relationships, we can get there. People in this community care about education. We'll work on that together. So, dates to know. Our next board meeting is November 19th. And at the last board meeting, what I asked the board members to do is ask us questions. Give us all the questions that you have to help inform you as we start making decisions about how to build this next budget. It's my goal to provide data or responses to as many of those questions. Some of them were really big questions, guys, and so we're going to keep, we have to work on some of those a little bit. But my goal is to have an evening more focused on, here's some more of the data. So if you didn't get quite enough slides tonight, tune into that board meeting. But then November 27th is, we've always done these, and like I said, I've had 9 community meetings already, so we've heard a lot. And a lot of the conversations, while they didn't always say budget, budget, budget right in front of them, they're helping us set priorities, and that's what that data is going to inform also. But there will be a more traditional budget feedback night. We're trying to set it up so that one is actually live streamed like our board meetings, and people should have a chance to call in if we can get all that working just right. But that is really that traditional input night on the budget. Now you've heard the challenges. You understand what we're trying to achieve. And so, like I said, both of those meetings begin at 6:30 in our Board of Education. So with that, how'd we do? Under 90 minutes. I want to thank you all for many things. One, investing the time of a reasonably length movie to sit here and listen. If I had to guess, this event, we probably don't have as many as you see at graduation, and we don't have as many as you see at a sporting event, but in terms of people coming out to think about what's going on in our schools, is probably the biggest gathering this community's seen in a long time. And I thank you for that. I thank all of you for being willing to show up and listen, because as I've said many times, the answers are going to come from you, and we're going to figure out how to do that together. So thank you all. Thank you for all the contributions you make to seeing our students succeed. We have an absolutely great school district here with a great batch of leaders and many wonderful people contributing to the work. And so I'm thankful to the entire staff, I'm thankful to the board, and I'm thankful to this community for its support of our schools. So with that, I hope you get home safely, have a great night, and I look forward to seeing you in the work in the future.